You are flying the only radio receiver that will ever hear a landing on Titan, and it is broken. You cannot repair it. Every setting it has is burned into chips 1,000,000,000 kilometers from the nearest screwdriver. This is the story of how engineers fixed a radio they could not touch by moving the spacecraft it was bolted to. The fix will cost 40% of the mission's spare fuel. It will hinge on a checkout mode that switches itself off after 60 seconds, and it starts with a radio test 5 years before the landing. In the year 2000, a pair of spacecraft were flying to Saturn as one. The larger of them, Cassini, would spend years orbiting the planet. Bolted to its side rode a European probe called Huygens, built to do one thing: fall through the atmosphere of Titan and describe it on the way down. The descent would last about 2.5 hours. It would happen exactly once, and every bit of data would exist in exactly one place: a radio link from the probe up to Cassini passing overhead. In February of that year, engineers ran the first realistic rehearsal of that link. NASA's Deep Space Network transmitted a mimic of the probe's signal from Earth, shaped like the real transmission, including the one thing the link had never been tested with in flight: the frequency shift caused by the two spacecraft rushing apart at 5.6 kilometers every second. With no motion in the signal, the receiver aboard Cassini performed perfectly. With mission-like motion applied, it began losing data. It was not noise, and it was not weakness. The signal was strong, the receiver was locked on the carrier, and whole frames of data were dissolving anyway. The cause took months of modeling to pin down, and it is almost painfully small. Relative speed shifts every frequency in a radio signal by the same fraction, here, about 19 parts in a million. The designers had compensated for that on the carrier wave, but the data itself is a clock too, with symbols arriving thousands of times a second. Shifted 19 parts in a million, they arrive a third of a symbol early every second, and the tracking loop, whose job is to stay centered on each symbol, was built too narrow to follow. It slips, and every slip tears a hole in the data.
Right, on the ground.
This would be one line in a configuration file. In flight, it was geology. Every critical setting of that receiver was frozen into hardware and firmware, and there was no path to change any of them. The team even tried transmitting controlled interference at their own receiver, hoping to bend its behavior from the outside. That failed too, and with the flyby as planned, the link would sit deep inside the failure zone for the entire descent. An independent board of inquiry reported in December of 2000. In January, a joint recovery task force was chartered, engineers from 9 organizations in 9 locations, given 6 months. Their charter accepted the hard truth up front: the receiver is what it is. If the radio could not be moved toward the mission would have to be moved toward the radio. They found levers in strange places. The probe's data clock came from a quartz crystal, and quartz drifts with temperature, so switching the probe on 4 hours early, letting 100 watts of electronics warm it before entry, would nudge the clock a few parts per million in the right direction. And the tracking loop locks better when the data changes often, so they could deliberately transmit packets of nothing but zeros, which the encoder turns into a steady drumbeat of alternations. Sending silence would help the receiver hear. They simulated keeping Cassini's flyby as planned and pulling every one of those levers at once. It worked the way a tourniquet works. To keep the link alive, more than half of every frame would have to be filled with zeros, which meant more than half the science thrown away before it was ever measured. The task force wrote it plainly: this could not be called a recovery. So they reached for the one parameter nobody plans to redesign. Cassini was meant to pass Titan at about 1,200 kilometers, sweeping in behind the probe and receding fast. The recovery flies the same pass at 65,000 kilometers around the far side, so that instead of racing away behind the probe, Cassini crosses the sky beside it. Seen from the probe, the closing speed nearly cancels at closest approach. The velocity is still there, the geometry spins it sideways. The frequency shift that broke the receiver almost vanishes, not because anything was fixed, but because the two spacecraft stopped moving apart. The price was real. Redesigning the tour cost about 95 meters per second of propellant, roughly 40% of the margin Cassini carried for its entire mission. The planners bought most of that back with one elegant choice, flying the pass retrograde against the direction of Titan's own motion, so the moon's movement around Saturn did part of the work. One extra Titan flyby was added, and the tour rejoined its original plan, 2 encounters later. One last trap remained. The receiver had been built expecting the old geometry. Its listening window was offset to catch a signal shifted by an approach it would now never make. In the new geometry, the real signal fell outside that window entirely. The escape came from the factory floor, a built-in checkout mode meant for testing on the ground that listens with no offset at all. It had one catch: lose lock for 60 seconds, and the receiver quietly falls back to its broken assumptions. So through the whole descent, Cassini would keep commanding its receiver back into test mode again and again, holding the door open by hand. On the 14th of January, 5 years after the test first caught the flaw, the probe named Huygens fell through Titan's haze for about 2.5 hours and landed, still transmitting. Cassini flew the recovery geometry, 65,000 kilometers out, its receiver held in test mode, its clock pre-warmed. The task force's analysis had promised no data loss within the mission as planned, and the science came home. Their own verdict, written before the landing: the science return of the mission is unaffected. And the receiver that flew to Titan was never repaired. It arrived exactly as flawed as the day the test caught it, every parameter still frozen, every limit still in place. What changed was everything around it: the trajectory, the temperature, the timing, the direction of the flyby itself. The task force closed its report with advice that costs nothing to read: test every requirement before you fly. And one more line: in plain words, never intentionally throw away data in a deep space mission, because somewhere in the numbers there may be a flaw you will spend 1.5 years and 40% of your fuel margin working around.